Before you can truly grasp what's going on inside someone else's mind, you have to confront the noise echoing in your own. This isn't some feel-good philosophy, it's the hard truth. Your thoughts, your triggers, your need to be right, to be liked, to be safe. These don't just affect how you feel, they shape how you see when your inner world is unsettled. You're not observing others clearly. You're watching them through the fog of your own emotion. That's not reading people, that's reading your fears. The real art of understanding people doesn't begin with clever questions or psychological hacks. It starts in silence, the kind of silence that Stoic philosophers trained for, where your ego steps aside and your attention becomes razor sharp when your mind is steady like still water. It becomes a mirror, and in that reflection the truth of others begins to appear without force, without effort. You see not just what they say, but what they mean, not just how they act, but what they carry. But the world doesn't teach you this. The world tells you to talk louder, be quicker, get the upper hand, and that noise, it drowns out everything subtle, everything real. If you've ever felt like people are wearing masks and you can't quite see through them, this video is for you, because we're going to peel back the layers, not by looking harder, but by listening deeper. We'll get into what Stoic clarity really means, how to calm your mental waters, and how that stillness makes you sharper than any trick or tactic ever could. If this kind of content speaks to something in you, if it brings you value or shifts how you see the world, there's a simple free way to show it all. I'll ask is that you hit that subscribe button, that's it. It helps more than you know, and it lets us keep diving deep into things that actually matter now. Let's get into it, because reading minds doesn't start with them, it starts with you. So the first skill, the foundational skill, is stillness, not the passive kind that numbs or avoids, but the living, aware kind that watches with full presence. It's not about freezing or zoning out. It's the kind of stillness that sharpens your senses, widens your field of attention, and removes the static of your own ego. No judgment, no need to fix, defend, or prepare a clever reply, just presence. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." This type of stillness is the beginning of that awakening, not through introspection alone, but through the disciplined act of not reacting to truly listen. Your mind must stop racing to respond. Have you ever sat with someone not just hearing them talk, but actually feeling the rhythm of their voice? The way their breath changes when they touch something raw? The silence they sit in before they finally reveal something real? Those moments are rarely loud. They don't come wrapped in perfect sentences. They live in the hesitations, the flickers of discomfort in someone's posture, the shift in tone so small you could miss it if your mind is elsewhere. But most people do miss it, not because those signs are buried, but because they're not quiet enough inside to notice. Our culture teaches speed, it praises the quick comeback, the instant analysis. But wisdom doesn't rush. Socrates taught that the unexamined life is not worth living. And yet, how many of us rush through conversations without ever examining what's underneath the surface of another's words? Stillness. Real stillness gives you a pause, a space between their truth and your reaction. And in that pause, something powerful happens. You begin to see the person in front of you, not as a character in your own story, but as someone unfolding in real time with their own rhythms and reasons. It's tempting to think we need more information to understand people, more words, more explanation. But often it's the restraint, the quiet that reveals the most. Plato believed that silence gives consent, but it also gives something else: clarity in silence. The truth of another person isn't forced out. It rises naturally. They sense you're not rushing to evaluate them, that you're actually there, and in that safety, they drop the mask sometimes without realizing it. The irony is, the more you practice stillness, the more you begin to notice what was always there. The micro-expressions, the nervous habits, the stories behind the stories you begin to feel when someone's words don't match their body. You don't need to analyze it, you just sense the dissonance. That's because your mind is no longer cluttered with your own projections. You're not overlaying your fears or fantasies onto the person you're simply seeing. Aristotle once said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." That applies just as much to reading others. When you're anchored in stillness, you start catching your own impulses. The quick judgments, the need to be right. The subtle ways you interrupt or steer the conversation back to you, and when you notice those patterns in yourself, they start losing power. You don't speak just to fill space anymore. You don't. You don't listen just to respond. You show up differently, and people feel it. There's a kind of reverence in that, a respect not just for the other person, but for the truth that silence can hold. The absence of noise doesn't mean the absence of meaning. It means you're making room for something deeper to emerge, something unfiltered, unperformed. When someone feels truly seen without commentary or correction, they begin to show you who they are, not because they want to impress you, but because they finally feel safe enough to be real. That's what stillness offers, not emptiness but clarity, not passivity but presence, and in a world addicted to distraction, that kind of attention is rare. It's powerful. It's the beginning of understanding someone not just through what they say, but through what they reveal when you've quieted enough to hear it. Reading people begins where your story ends. You can't truly understand someone if your mind is still writing its own script in the background, rehearsing comebacks, clinging to assumptions, or waiting for a chance to turn the spotlight back on yourself. That constant inner narration keeps you from seeing what's really in front of you. It distorts everything to read someone clearly. You have to drop the story you're telling yourself and just observe. But what does that mean? What exactly are you observing? Everything and not in some vague mystical way? I'm talking about the real physical signals that most people overlook. It's not just about the words. Someone says it's about what lives between those words. The pause before they answer a difficult question. The way their voice drops when something personal comes up, the flicker in their expression, when they hear something that touches a nerve. These details aren't hidden, they're just quiet, and if your mind is loud, you'll miss every single one. We've all been taught to focus on the face value of words. But the truth is, people often say what they think they're supposed to say, what they believe will protect them, please you, or avoid conflict. It's the body that tells the truth. The body can't keep up the act. There's always a giveaway. Maybe it's in the tension around the eyes, the quick glance toward the floor, the hands that fidget when they should be still, and when words and body language don't match. Trust the body. Aristotle once said, "We are what we repeatedly do." And that's not just about habits. It applies to how people reveal themselves. Repeated discomfort in the same areas. A pattern of withdrawal when emotions rise. These aren't one-time. Glitches, they're signals, and the more you pay attention, the clearer they become. It's not about decoding people like a puzzle. It's about watching long enough to see what doesn't change. When the mask slips, there's something powerful in simply observing without reacting, when you're not rushing to fill the silence or shape. The moment your awareness sharpens, you start to feel when something's off, not because of logic, but because your attention is fully there. Carl Jung spoke about the shadow, the parts of ourselves. We hide or deny, and you'll often see someone's shadow, not in what they say, but in what they avoid. The topics they skim over, the emotions they brush aside, the discomfort they try to laugh away. And maybe you've noticed this when someone says they're okay, but something in your gut knows they're not. That's not imagination, that's perception, but it only kicks in when you've stopped projecting your own fears onto them. When you've let go of the urge to fix, judge, or rescue, that's when you start seeing clearly. Socrates once said, "To know thyself is the beginning of wisdom." That wisdom doesn't just help you understand who you are, it makes you better at understanding others too. Because when you're self-aware, you stop confusing their pain with your past. You stop seeing their silence as rejection or their anger as a personal attack. You start reading what's actually there, not what your past has trained you to expect. Reading people isn't about being clever, it's about being present. It's not something you force, it's something you allow. You don't need to figure someone out in a minute, just notice quiet. Your inner world and the outside world start speaking volumes, not always in words, but always in truth. People can lie with language. They can say "I'm fine" with a calm tone, a smile, and perfect timing, while everything else in their body tells a different story. The shoulders fold, and not from comfort, but from withdrawal. Their laughter sounds right, but their eyes stay still, lifeless. Disconnected, they nod at your words, but their body is already facing the exit. These are not random gestures. These are signs, clear ones. If you're paying attention, the untrained eye looks for words. The trained one looks for truth, and truth often lives in what's unspoken. Plato once said, "All learning has an emotional base, and emotional truth can't be faked for long." It leaks out not through loud announcements, but through posture, breath, and nervous tension. So, If you want to get better at reading, people stop focusing only on what they say. Start focusing on what they show. But here's the thing, before you can read anyone else, you have to be honest about your own signals. That's where it begins. You have to become the observer of yourself. How does your body change when you're pretending everything's okay? What does your face do when you're trying not to cry? Notice the way your jaw tenses when you're hiding. Anger the way your hands fidget when you feel exposed. These small behaviors are your tells, and once you learn your own, you'll start seeing them in others, not through effort, but through recognition. Carl Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate that includes the unconscious movements of your body. The things you've been doing for years, without even realizing your body remembers everything, even when your mind tries to forget, and so does everyone else. The more honest you are with your own body's truth, the more easily you'll spot the same. In others' reading, people isn't about mind games. It's about paying attention to the parts of communication most people overlook. Think about it when someone you know walks into a room and says they're okay, but you feel they're not. That's not magic. That's presence. That's you catching the misalignment between what they're saying and what they're showing. The more still you are inside, the louder those subtle signals become, and it's not about overanalyzing every move someone makes. It's about seeing patterns over time. That's where the real story unfolds, not in a single twitch or glance, but in the way those behaviors repeat when emotions rise. Socrates taught that an unexamined life is not worth living, and if you're not examining your own signals, first, your interpretation of others will always be tinted with bias, assumption, or projection, so you start by watching yourself. You study your reactions, your tension, your deflections, not to criticize, but to understand. The more clearly you see your own habits, the more those patterns start to make sense when you see them in the people around you. Their silence won't confuse you. Their forced smile won't fool you because you've seen it before. In yourself. This kind of awareness doesn't just make you more observant. It makes you more compassionate when you recognize someone else's mask. You don't tear it off. You understand why it's there. You've worn one too. And that understanding, that calm presence, is what draws people out. Not pressure, not questioning, just your quiet ability to see beyond the surface without judgment. Reading others starts with reading yourself. The body speaks always. It's your job to learn the language, not to manipulate, but to connect, because behind every movement, every pause, every shift in energy, there's a story waiting to be seen. Self-awareness sharpens external awareness. It always starts with you. The clearer you are about your own habits, your reactions, your emotional patterns, the easier it becomes to spot those same things in other people. But if you've never stopped to notice what your body does when you're anxious, or how your tone shifts when you're hiding something, then your ability to read others will be shaky. At best, you'll be guessing and guessing. Especially when it comes to human behavior, is dangerous. You might mistake silence for rejection or confidence for arrogance. What you see in others will always be filtered through what you haven't yet faced in yourself. So when you're with someone, really with them, slow down, drop the urge to steer the conversation or fill the silence. Pay attention to the space before anyone speaks. That space holds more than we give it credit, for there's energy in a room that changes even if nothing is said out loud. The way someone's body shifts when a certain topic comes up. The subtle tension in the air that no one wants to name. You don't have to label it, just notice it. Because understanding doesn't begin with conclusions. It begins with feeling and know. This isn't about reading minds or using tricks to get inside someone's head. It's much simpler and much harder. It's about being present fully, and that's rare. Most people aren't really there. In conversations, they're distracted, waiting to speak, scrolling their thoughts like a phone screen. But presence is different. It's not loud, it doesn't push, it doesn't perform, it just listens. Carl Jung once said the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed, but for any true reaction to happen, both people must be fully there. People don't open up because you say all the right things. They open up when they feel safe, and safety often comes from silence, not speech, from the kind of attention that doesn't pressure or probe, just sits quietly and allows. Real presence doesn't chase answers. It gives someone room to reveal themselves if and when they're ready, and when that happens, it's not because of something clever. You said it's because you stopped trying to be clever at all. Think back. When was the last time someone looked at you with no agenda, no performance, no distraction? When they weren't waiting to prove a point or one up your story. That kind of attention is powerful. You trusted them, didn't you? Not because of what they said, but because of what they didn't need to say. They weren't trying to be impressive. They were just there. That's when you opened up, not because they demanded it, but because their stillness invited it. And that's the paradox. The less you try to read people, the more you end up seeing, not because you're working harder, but because you've stopped interfering. You've stopped reaching, guessing, pushing, and now. The truth has space to speak, but it doesn't shout. It never does it, whispers in body language, in the slight change in rhythm, in the avoidance of a topic. You don't catch those things when you're rushing. You catch them when you're quiet. What's most revealing isn't found in big moments. It's found in repetition, in the patterns that emerge when someone thinks no one is watching, how they react to discomfort, whether they always deflect emotion, whether their energy shrinks when asked a vulnerable question. These are not isolated glitches, they're signals. Socrates believed that wisdom begins in wonder, and when you stop needing to label everything right away. When you sit in that wonder, you begin to see people not as you wish them to be, but as they are. Anyone can appear calm once they can hold it together during a quiet moment, give a kind word when it's easy. Tell the truth when the stakes are low. That doesn't make them calm, kind, or honest. It just means they had one moment where everything aligned, but if they start breaking down when pressure shows up, if they lie when they feel cornered, deflect when emotions get close, or shrink the second someone sees through the surface, those aren't accidents, they're rhythms. Patterns, and patterns always speak louder than isolated behavior. The mind, when pushed, reveals itself, not in the words we prepare, but in the things we repeat when we're uncomfortable. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." People live out their unconscious habits like a script over and over, especially when no one's watching the way. Someone reacts to discomfort, how they avoid certain topics, the way they switch the subject. Every time emotions come up, that's not coincidence, it's communication, and your job isn't to label it or jump to conclusions. Your job is to observe, to witness, not from a place of control or judgment, but from presence. Let the patterns unfold. Let their choices stack up over time. One action might mean anything, two might still be unclear, but 3, 4, 5. The rhythm becomes visible. That's when you start to understand how someone truly operates. Socrates once warned, "The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing." That includes people if you try to define them too quickly. If you rush to pin down who they are, based on one interaction, you'll likely get it wrong. Most of what we are isn't visible in a single conversation. Real understanding takes time. Let that be okay. And maybe you're wondering, what if I still misread? What if I get it wrong? Here's the thing, you will sometimes. Everyone does. We're not built to be perfect readers of people. We bring our own stories, our own triggers, our own past into every observation. But the goal isn't to be perfect. It's to be open, to pay attention, not with suspicion, but with curiosity, to let people show you who they are. Not by what they say once, but by what they repeat without realizing it. Patterns don't lie. They may not always be loud, but they are honest. And when you stop pushing, when you stop rushing to define someone, those patterns begin to show themselves naturally. All you need to do is wait. Let the rhythm speak, and when it does, believe it not as a final judgment, but as a quiet truth that's been there all along, just waiting to be seen. Clarity isn't about being certain. It's not about drawing fast conclusions or figuring someone out in the first 5 minutes. Clarity is about being open. It means stepping into a moment without needing to be right, without rushing to define what something means. You don't read people by locking into your first impression. You read them by staying curious. Real curiosity isn't pushy. It doesn't try to finish people's sentences. It doesn't assume. It already knows the answer. Curiosity is quiet. It listens beyond the surface. It hears what isn't being said. Carl Jung once said everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. That kind of understanding begins when we stop reacting and start exploring. When someone says, "I'm fine," but every story they tell drips with disappointment. Pay attention to the story, not just the summary. When they say, "I trust you," but suddenly dodge. When you touch on something deep, listen to the shift in energy, not just the words. Truth rarely walks in wearing a sign. It hides in the little gaps, the contradictions, the places where what's said and what's shown don't quite line up in contradiction. More often than not is where the truth lives, not because people want to deceive you, but because people are complicated. We're always balancing who we are with who we think we need to be. So, if you're only listening for consistency, you'll miss the real stuff, the uncertainty, the fear, the unfinished thoughts. Those are the pieces that matter. That's why you need something deeper than analysis. You need presence, a groundedness that doesn't move. Every time someone else's energy shifts, because the last skill, the one that pulls all the others together, is this: hold your center. If their anger makes you flinch, if their sadness drowns you, if their silence makes you spiral, you're not reading, you're reacting, and when you react, you lose the signal. You can't see them clearly because your emotions take up all the space. As long as you're tangled in your own feelings, there's no room to notice what's actually unfolding in front of you. But if you can stay steady, if you can feel their tension without tightening up yourself, if you can witness their fear without making it yours, then something powerful happens. You become the still pond, and people without meaning to start showing you who they are. Not because you pressed them, not because you figured them out, but because they felt safe. They sensed that you weren't trying to control or judge or fix them. You were just there. Open present, Plato said, be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. That battle isn't always loud. It doesn't always show up in clear, obvious ways. But when you're calm enough, quiet enough, attentive enough, you start to notice what others miss: the tremor in the voice, the shift in the eyes, the pause that carries weight. And none of that requires certainty. It just requires presence. When you hold your center, you become the mirror. And in that mirror, people begin to see themselves, not the version they rehearse for the world, but the one that slips through. In honest moments, that's where real connection starts, not in knowing everything, but in making space for what wants to be seen. In the end, the quietest presence often hears the loudest truths you don't need to chase. Understanding, just create the stillness for it to arrive. If this spoke to something in you, there's another video on the screen now that'll take you even deeper. Thank you for being here and for being a part of Stoic Pathways. The journey continues, not in noise, but in awareness. Stay grounded, stay curious, and I'll see you again soon.